Hi, welcome to this Q&A where we discuss the state of the union and whether we should stay or leave. Just a few thoughts before I start in on the questions. I take the rhetoric of Trump and Miller and the people, Vance and the others around him very seriously. I don't think they're joking. We have already seen them make moves, for instance, against law firms that defended or had clients that uh, were hostile or challenged the Trump administration. We have seen an assault on universities and, of course, an assault on the media. I guess Jimmy Kimmel is going to go back on the air, but I'm almost certain he isn't going to say anything anymore about Trump. We have seen people who have legal status in this country seized by masked goons in ICE. In the case of a Tufts graduate student. And I think since the assassination of Charlie Kirk, who was almost instantly turned into a martyr for the movement, this has turbocharged this assault on the so-called radical left. The radical left is a fairly marginal, insignificant force in the United States. But by the radical left, Trump, of course, means, George Soros, Adam Schiff, anyone in the Democratic Party. It's an absurd kind of characterization of their political stance. But basically anybody who is not obsequious and bows before the whims and the narcissism of Trump himself. When we saw Code Pink, and I just did an interview with Medea Benjamin, one of the co-founders of Code Pink, which will come out Wednesday. When we saw them, or members of Code Pink, shout out or challenge Trump and his cabinet when they were in a DC restaurant, Trump talked about RICO laws. And of course, Miller is talking about the assassination of Kirk is part of an organizational assault. So there's a lot, not just in terms of things that have been said, but things that have been done that make our situation extremely precarious. Of course, I've reported from all sorts of authoritarian regimes around the world. For someone like me, the question is whether I have a voice or I don't. I mean, I'm hit with algorithms and deplatformed, and of course, I've been pushed out of the mainstream media. People like Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, myself are all part of the mainstream media a decade ago. Doesn't exist anymore. And as long as I have a voice, of course, I feel a responsibility to use it. Like many people, especially people who have fought the Israel lobby for many, many, many years and been a target of that lobby, the unleashing of that lobby, which we've seen on campuses, the attacks against critics, the deplatforming, the faculty members like Catherine Franke from Columbia Law School who lost their positions for speaking out on behalf of the student protesters. I have to assume I'm somewhere there. And if this process continues the way Trump and those around him want it to continue, then any voice of dissent will essentially be shut down and silenced. At that point, of course, I lived 20 years outside the United States. If I have no voice at all, then having seen this happen in other countries where dissidents have had their voices completely silenced, at that point, you really have to leave because they will wait a few months and then they'll come take you away after there's already within the media or social milieu, that you've already been silenced, you've already been disappeared. So they disappear your voice first, and then they disappear you physically. I don't know what I'm going to do, but of course it's something that I consider. And this is from Cass. What if we've decided we can't leave for whatever reason? What are some suggestions for how folks should be preparing for the short and longer term here? For personal reasons, specifically thinking about two states, Texas and New York. I mean, if you can't leave, then the question is, do you muzzle yourself in the hopes that you will not be a target? Or do you continue to engage in activism and speak out, putting everything that you have, your family, your employment, everything else at risk? That's an extremely difficult question to answer. And I once did an event a couple of years ago with Margaret Atwood in Toronto, and she said something I thought was very prescient. We were denouncing the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. She said that as writers, she and I had a kind of privileged position in that we could speak out without the kinds of consequences of someone who worked within a corporate structure or worked within an institution, and that it was our job. That was our job to challenge these systems of power. But those who, for financial reasons, should not in any way feel that they had failed, or that there was some kind of obligation that they had that they were not fulfilling. I thought that was pretty smart. This is Solo Grammar. As someone who has contemplated the idea of leaving for quite some time, I have lately felt less inclined because there doesn't seem to be anywhere safe. Our national issues are global ones. AI married to government power is inescapable. Quality of life involves family for me, so what might I gain does not seem worth it. Are there other ways to leave this madness besides geographically? Well, I guess you could check out and just stop following the news, and sever yourself from. So yeah, I suppose there's a way to check out. I wouldn't recommend it because it leaves you completely defenseless. Daniel Bolton, Marjorie Taylor Greene has recently called for national divorce of the United States along political partisan lines. Do you find that to be a possible scenario in the future? A national divorce of the United States along political partisan lines. I'm not quite sure what she means. I mean, a divorce from the power structure, which is the credibility, of course, the power structure on both the Trump administration and the Democratic Party is disintegrating by the hour. I don't know that there's yet any kind of viable alternative. Andrew C.K., can you speak to your experiences in Bosnia and the disbelief that people held on to despite evidence to the contrary? Yeah, that's a very important point. So if you take the war in Sarajevo, Sarajevo was a mixed city, cosmopolitan city, intermarriage between Croats, Muslims, and Serbs, secular. And they just couldn't believe that there was a war. I've written and said this many times. That was also true in Pristina. I covered the war in Kosovo. And I, along with my photographer, Wade Goddard, made the first trip with armed factions of the Kosovo Liberation Army. And I remember going back to Pristina and telling friends of mine, Kosovar Albanians, highly educated, I mean, certainly extremely intelligent people, that I had been with the Kosovo Liberation Army. And they kept saying, no, that's just Serbs dressed up like, rebels or guerrillas in order to justify the repression against us. They had no idea what was happening until literally they were herded onto boxcars and sent by train to refugee camps in Macedonia. That's true everywhere. That was true in Weimar. After Weimar, with the rise of Nazism, it's extremely hard for people to grasp the fragility of the social structure around them and how rapidly it can disintegrate. And even though, of course, it's happening to us, I think there's perhaps an inability on the part of Americans who've not experienced this kind of authoritarian rule to see how ominous this can become and how quickly this police state can be cemented into place. Eric McCormick, what are ways that one can improve as a reader in terms of properly understanding the material and applying it to one's own writings? I was good friends with great poet Gerald Stern, and he used to say, any writer, you read, and then write. You have to, unfortunately, in the age of digital media, the electronic hallucinations that bombard us on our phones and our computers and everything else, you've got to build walls in order to read now. It has to be proactive. But all great or good writers are grounded, and especially writers that care about the musicality of language. I went to Jerry's 80th birthday party, and they'd rented a restaurant, and it was filled with most of the major poets of the United States, and they were downing bottles of wine. And at the end of the evening, or late in the evening, they all began to recite from memory poems that they loved. So if, all good writers are readers, and then, of course, all good writing is rewriting. Patricia Hoke, what media should I subscribe to if, as you say, the Washington Post and the NYT are so bad? It depends on what the topic. So, I mean, I look at a variety of media. Aretz still does some good stuff. They're not as good as they were before October 7th. I read Le Monde. I read The Guardian. I usually will listen to NewsHour on BBC at least once a day. I do read the New York Times, although, the coverage of the genocide and the coverage of the student protest movements has been appallingly bad. I don't read the Post too much. In terms of Gaza, I really turn daily, more than once a day, to Al Jazeera, which has done a tremendous job. Middle East Eye has done a great job. I mean, I focus a lot on Gaza for obvious reasons. Middle East Eye, Mundo Weiss, and Electronic Intifada are all great. And then there's a few writers like Jonathan Cook. His Substack is great. Jonathan was in the Middle East. He knows it. So yeah, I look at like any news junkie, I look at a lot of different sources. Max Blumenthal's done some great stuff on the Gray Zone, Consortium News, posts great stuff. My stuff goes out on SharePost, which is good. So, but you do have to be proactive. You can't be a passive consumer of news. You have to go looking for it. Anton Stamfel, hello from Sydney. What do you think of the conflicts in Nepal, Indonesia, and the Philippines? Looks to me like the U.S. stayed encouraged. In Nepal, it looks like for the fight of U.S. digital dominance. I have been so focused on the genocide. I've not paid close attention. However, since you're from Sydney, I will be there in October. I give the Edward Said lecture in Adelaide, and I speak in Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne. I think that's it. Starting on, I think it's the 16th I start. Daniel Gerhardt, you said a labor movement is necessary for escaping where the U.S. is headed. Are other direct actions like assassination or sabotage a path? Well, once you get into that kind of political violence, like the murder of Kirk, then it's a gift to the police state, because, as you saw with Kirk, the idea that people are going to confront the state through violence is not only counterproductive, but a fantasy, because that violence is the language the state speaks far, far better than we do. I mean, we have 60,000 members of the special forces alone, and I've seen these people at work. They're death squads. So violence of any type, and of course I've even opposed black bloc vandalism, is exactly what the state wants, because it gives them the license to instantly shut everything down. And you've seen them turbocharge uh, uh, their assaults following the Kirk assassination. Gary, Jen, for a long time, the ruling class seems to have preferred the facade of stability and democratic norms to placate the masses. The Trump administration appears to have almost entirely abandoned this pretense. Are they acting in defiance of the oligarchs that have long desired the former option, or has the ruling class shifted to desire a more authoritarian style of public governance? I described the last election as one between oligarchs and corporatists, which in terms of in the rubric of capitalism, they want different things. Corporatists want stable trade deals. They want stability itself, especially because they make investments, often overseas, and it will take them some time, often sometimes years, in order for them to get a return on their profits, or to begin to build a profit. Oligarchs like chaos. They want the system to disintegrate and break down because they monetize social services, and they've already gone a long way to doing that. Electrical grids, parking authority, sewer systems, it all gets privatized. And of course, the quality of the service deteriorates, the prices get jacked up. They like internal chaos because then people need to hire private security. They need to go into gated communities. So the oligarchs won. But that's what this election was really about. It was the corporatists gathered around the Democratic Party and Trump, and the oligarchs Biden, and the oligarchs gathered around Trump and the Republicans. Huey, Nkrumah, since socialism will not end racism and the U.S. seems to be permanently racist, how do you feel about revolutionary Black nationalism? Well, nothing will end racism or bigotry. It will always exist in any society. But socialism goes a long way to ameliorating institutional racism. And by socialism, I mean everybody has access to free medical health care. Everybody has access to free higher education. There's either a guaranteed minimum income or full employment. A socialist system creates a situation, and including good public schools, which we don't have in marginal communities, by which those who are most disadvantaged within the society at least have some kind of a chance. So, and that's why King was a socialist. I mean, he understood that there would never be racial justice until there was economic justice. So, I mean, that's why I'm a socialist. Ivan Pavlich, if we compare the Red Scare era and the policy of the current administration, what was worse in your opinion? If we talk about the Red Scare era immediately after World War I, it was, I mean, the Eugene V. Debs, the socialist presidential candidate, was sent to prison, mass deportations of leading anarchists and revolutionists, Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, the shutting down of publications like Appeal to Reason and The Masses. These were socialist publications with a huge reach. The breaking and outlawing of labor unions, that was probably worse. But there was far more opposition because on the eve of World War I, these powerful socialist and communist movements really threatened the power structure. And that's why Wilson passed, a series of laws that essentially criminalized any kind of dissent. So I don't know that we've reached that point, but we're moving quickly towards it. PFS, as the Trump administration becomes increasingly openly fascistic, do you think we can talk the soldiers out of following orders? What would you say to them? Say it now. Well, we have yet to see a direct confrontation in terms of violence between National Guard troops and people on the streets. Why is Trump sending the National Guard to Chicago, Washington, D.C.? He's sending them to Democratic cities because, of course, he fears some kind of backlash as things become more and more draconian, as things become harder and harder for the working class and the working poor. And at that moment, I, of course, would repeat what Oscar Romero, which got him assassinated, told the Salvadoran soldiers, which is, do not fire on your fellow citizens. Gary, Jen, who are the oligarchs and who are the Democrats? The oligarchs are, Lloyd Blankfein. I mean, there's a long list of oligarchs. And who are the Democrats? The Democrats are their puppets. And that's part of the problem. They don't answer to us. I mean, 77% of registered Democrats want to cut arms shipments to Israel. 68% want a new leadership, but it doesn't matter because the Democratic Party does not function as a political party. The base has absolutely no say. I mean, look at the choreographed convention that nominated Kamala Harris, who never ran in a primary. I mean, so that billionaire class, the billionaires own both political parties. There are slight differences between the two, but the party's not beholden to the base. And of course, Trump has completely sold out his base. Now that Trump is attempting to bring the National Guard to different cities, liberal governors like Newsom, Pritzker standing up to him, is it possible the U.S. to go through a balkanization process? I don't see a balkanization process. I think that the federal government, the concentration of power is so centralized that they can essentially bend most of the rest of the country to their will. I don't see power as being diffuse enough to balkanize the country. Guitar Jim Brooke, I watched your interviews a lot. Why don't you have Paul Street on more often? Another question I have, do you think people power will work at making the elite scared enough to do the correct thing? I have interviewed Paul, and I like his work, but I haven't done it recently. That's a good point. Do you think people power will work at making the elites scared? Well, the elites will become scared when we start crippling the machinery of power. And if they're scared, they'll respond. Politics is a game of fear. And it's our job to make them afraid. But it won't happen until there are mass movements and organization, because our power is collective. It's not individual. That won't happen until, we organize. I mean, for instance, with the freight railroad workers strike, which Biden stepped in to block, that would have created havoc within the economy. And the elites were scared, so they blocked the ability of the freight rail workers to strike. So, once the elites become frightened, they respond. Years like fevers, what sustains and replenishes you? I mean, a few things. Actually teaching in the prison. I've been in there so long, since 2010. So I've built very close relationships, because the sentences are so long, with many of my students and their families and their kids. It's sacred time when you're in that prison classroom. So that's one thing. I don't tend to socialize much, so it's, I live kind of hermetically sealed within my own family. And I deal with trauma, which of course I carry from my years as a war correspondent, by just religiously going to the gym every day. And it just kicks in enough endorphins. My wife read me a passage in a book she'd read about a recovering addict who talked about lifting weights and how, it forces you to concentrate on the weight. And it pulls you out of yourself. That kind of resonated with me, and I read. I mean, reading is a comfort. I'm reading a great book called Fatal Shore on the history of Australia because I'm going to Australia, and it'll pull you into another reality. I mean, so yeah, I guess those things. Thoughts on Jeremy Corbyn, your party fiasco, and why the left schisms so often. I really admire Corbyn, and I hope his building of a third party in Britain is successful. Why does the left schism so often? Oh, probably ego. I mean, Mario Vargas Llosa wrote a very funny book about this. What was it? It was, The Secret Life of Alejandro Maita, where, it's a splinter of a Trotskyite group or something that meets in a garage, and there's 7 of them. But yeah, I think that the left is often its own worst enemy. And they tend to create schisms over what Freud would call the narcissism of minor difference. This is Liam. I'm a huge fan of your work. Thank you. As a 23-year-old law student in the U.S. with a great family, is there a future for me here? I mean, I'm pretty bleak about where we're headed. We haven't even talked about the climate crisis yet, which, as a nation, we're kind of pretending isn't happening. And the thing about the United States is that it's a deeply violent country, unlike, let's say, Canada. And I mean, mass shootings at schools are so normalized, they're hardly even reported. So there are some very frightening pathologies here. Empires, when they crumble and collapse, are very, very ugly places. As Alfred McCoy, the historian, points out, empires are actually very fragile because their ecosystem extends far beyond their borders. So when the empire starts to disintegrate, it often has huge ramifications in the homeland. We've seen the billionaire class and corporations hollow the country out from the inside. How have they responded with this massive social inequality? I mean, 60% of this country is living paycheck to paycheck. They bring back the mechanisms of control in the outer reaches of empire: militarized police, wholesale surveillance, drones, etc., and use those forms of control that keep a subject population on the within the empire in check on us. Are we headed to the late stages of the Roman Empire? Yes. Is there anything we can do to stop this from happening? No. How do we get the power back to the people? I mean, empires rise, fall, and decline. That is just a fact. There's no empire that is an exception. We are not an exception. We had a 200-year run, which is pretty much what the height of the Roman Empire had. We are replicating all the pathologies of disintegrating empires. Empires, by the way, always destroy their urban centers first, which we've done. I mean, our cities are just wastelands. They get taken over by hedonistic, short-sighted, often idiotic dictators or demagogues who live in tremendous opulence. I mean, I forget the figure. I just read it the other day. I mean, the Trump family has increased their personal wealth by $2 billion or something, and they're parasitic in the sense that they leech off the rest of the country as the empire goes down. I don't see anything to prevent that. And so it becomes, how do we insulate ourselves as best as possible from the negative effects of decline? Are the corporatist people like Soros and the Kochs, while the oligarchs are people like Thiel, Musk, Gates? Yeah, I mean, so oligarchs create toll booths. That's what they do. It's classic rentier capitalism. They set up a toll booth, preferably for a vital service that you need, like water, for instance, and they force you to pay. They don't actually produce anything, but they force you to pay in order to get that commodity or get that service. That's how oligarchs make their money. That's what private equity firms do. That, they harvest corporations, they will buy them and then strip them and kill them to make short-term profit. That's classic oligarchic behavior. Reggie T, we're running out of time with the impacts of the climate crisis. How does this figure into the current situation? Yeah, we are running out of time. How does it figure into the current situation? Well, the genocide in Gaza is the message to the rest of the world, and in particularly the global South. And that the message is, we have everything, and if you try and take it away from us, we will kill you. That including using genocide. So rather than deal with the climate crisis in a rational way, we're creating climate fortresses, and as things become more desperate, those countries with industrial weaponry will use it in the way Israel is using its industrial weaponry on the Palestinians. Ryan B, why are Western countries now recognizing Palestine, and is it genuinely in the interest of the Palestinian people? No, it's performative. It's essentially it's meaningless in terms of what it does for the Palestinians. I mean, 80% of the West Bank is already controlled by Israel. Gaza doesn't exist. But it's a way to perhaps absolve themselves in the eyes of history for their complicity in the genocide. And at the same time, like the UK is recognizing a Palestinian state, which a two-state solution is now an impossibility. It's only cut its arms shipments to Israel by 10%. So it's still providing the weapons to sustain the genocide. So yeah, I find it very cynical and rather meaningless. Elias Bresnik, can you briefly outline your theory of social change and how it's possible in the current landscape? Well, we have to rebuild the militant labor unions that we had in the past. That is what created, perhaps the most complete socialist state in Sweden. I'm talking, several decades ago. That's what created the Labour Party in the UK, which Tony Blair destroyed. So we have to, recover that kind of organized militancy and use it to constantly batter the machinery of state, which is through blockages, strikes, any mechanism we have to disrupt the commercial machinery and the political machinery of state. That is the only route that will create or recreate any kind of social equality. Marxist Lad, what do you think of the total information scramble regarding Kirk's assassination, including the Israel did it theory, and now his producer saying the bullet didn't go through Kirk because he's a man of steel? Well, we don't know. I mean, certainly the Trump administration and the far right has weaponized the assassination. Max Blumenthal, and I did an interview with him, which is, you can watch it on YouTube, interviewed people around who knew Kirk well and said, and of course, as Max points out, Kirk's base among even Republican youth, there's very little support for Israel and the genocide. And he didn't step out and defend the Palestinians or condemn Zionism, but he was certainly moving. And according to Max's reporting, he was really dressed down by Bill Ackerman and Netanyahu and others who provided significant funding for his group. These figures like Kirk or Barry Weiss, they don't build anything from scratch. They have huge Zionist donors who, as long as they toe the line, will provide massive amounts of money for them. We don't know. I mean, my personal feeling is I don't think Israel had anything to do with it. Israel can crush Kirk by just shutting off the spigot, by shutting down his funding, and then, of course, demonizing him. But yeah, the distance that apparently was opening up between Kirk and Israel is kind of fascinating and shows the weak position that Israel, the kind of eroding position that Israel is in within the United States. I mean, you have Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance, denouncing the genocide. Fishboy, what are your thoughts on the Federal Reserve, the manipulation of our wages via inflation? Do you think usury could be outlawed in this country? Well, this is, I mean, you go all the way back to the 70s, the corporatists, the billionaire class have suppressed wages because debt peonage is highly profitable. They they have created a system by which people are that the wages have been so suppressed that people in desperation, of course, are not only working more than one job, and not only that, but couples will have to both work jobs in order to try and maintain any kind of a middle class income. But at the same time, that desperation and that gig economy and the breaking of unions and Walmart, Amazon are, of course, the poster children for this, has frightened people away from any kind of activism or union organizing because they fear the loss of the job. They fear being thrown back into that status or that situation of underemployment or chronic underemployment or chronic unemployment. Daniel, do you have any good books on Canadian history? Wow. I haven't read a lot of Canadian history. I mean, there's some great Canadian novels. But yeah, I don't know. That's not a strong point. Marty Galnick, your work is tremendous. Thank you. How do you deal with purposeful dumbing down of society? Yeah, I mean, that's a good question because that is also by intent. So you destroy public education, and public education in this country, as Ellen Schrecker points out, we're talking a few decades ago, was one of, the jewels of our democracy. City College, when it was free, we're talking now, I don't know, let's go back to the 40s and 50s, was a great, great university and educated an entire generation of immigrants, from Colin Powell and Abe Rosenthal. I don't hold them up as great figures, but they both went through City College. So, and then the kind of, and I wrote a book about it, Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle, severing people from print, of course, is a way of severing them from complex or nuanced thought. That kind of mindless entertainment, amusing ourselves to death, was a good book that kind of foresaw it all coming. Authoritarian regimes always seek to keep its population in darkness, in ignorance, because they're far more easily manipulated. This is Alex Cabrera. How do you see the U.S. relationship with Mexico going forward and the changes in Mexico since 2018? I admire your work, Sue, in Australia. Great. It's a very long flight, but I have a couple of good books. I mean, Trump, there's no respect for Mexican sovereignty, of course. And I don't think that's rhetorical. The silly renaming of the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, the threatening to deploy U.S. military forces to go after Mexican drug cartels. So the Mexicans are legitimately quite worried about overreach on the part of Trump, the Trump administration, and what they might do. So, yeah, I mean, he's a bully, and his administration it doesn't engage in diplomacy; it engages in extortion. Jan Bennett, I'm a new father in a world that feels like it's in its final years. How do you, as a father, reconcile with the decline of the world? I mean, that's the worst of it. And, I don't know if we're going to win, but we have to fight back, given what we've bequeathed to our children and the next generation. We may not succeed, but, hopefully, we'll have lived our lives with enough integrity that they'll say we tried. This is Rafari 11. You've noted the severity of Trump's crackdown on speech. That's beyond dispute. As Gramsci showed, bourgeois freedom is always shaped by ruling class hegemony. Marcuse warned in Repressive Tolerance that speech is tolerated only when it's harmless to power. That is very true. Doesn't this suggest that what we call free speech in liberal democracy has always been more illusion than reality, permitted only when it becomes threatening? Chomsky writes about this. So, what is the role of the liberal class? What is permitted? I mean, Chomsky himself virtually blacklisted because Chomsky, so critiques. I mean, the liberal class is allowed to critique the excesses of a capitalist democracy, to perhaps ameliorate some of these excesses, but it's not allowed to critique the virtues. Once you go after the motives or the virtues, then you are immediately banished. And this was, of course, what happened precisely to Chomsky. So, what we call free speech, and of course, the liberal class posits itself as the moral arbiter of society. And every time the left challenges the system itself, it's the role of the liberal class to discredit the left. Because, of course, if the left has any kind of moral authority or intellectual authority, it's going to expose the liberal elites for their collaboration with the centers of power. So, for instance, on the eve of the first Gulf War, for the second Gulf War, on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, I was given 15 minutes on fresh air. I'd never get on now, of course. It's a Zionist radio show, to speak about why we shouldn't invade Iraq. And then the counter, I didn't know until I heard it, the counter argument why we should invade Iraq was by Michael Ignatieff, who I know. And he talked about his protesting the war in Vietnam and how we had to liberate the people of Iraq and all this kind of stuff. So they use the liberal class has always been used. This is the kind of quid pro quo, and why they're within a functioning capitalist democracy. They're given a certain status because they're used to crush the left. Now, of course, we've seen, and this was the focus of my book, Death of the Liberal Class. We've seen these corporatists who don't understand the role of the liberal class destroy the liberal class itself. That's what Trump is doing. The liberal class has become the enemy. And so that mechanism, that kind of safety valve that was represented by the liberal class, has been broken. And at that point, you have full-on authoritarianism. Nicholas, in regards to fleeing, most working class families that would even entertain the idea of leaving don't have the financial means to do so. So what are our options in that situation? Well, that is That is an extremely important question, because those of us who have the capacity to leave have that capacity because we have either the connections or the financial means to do so, and others are trapped. And that's, of course, one of the great hesitations I have in terms of not leaving. I mean, I think by leaving, sure, you can live abroad and critique. I mean, Glenn Greenwald's in Brazil, and Jason Stanley just went to Toronto, the fascist scholar from Yale. But I think you do surrender your moral authority, because you're not taking the risks that others around you are taking. I think for me, it's if I had no voice, and it wouldn't take much. I mean, these digital platforms could shut me down tomorrow. So if I had no voice at all, then I think, I could see leaving, just because my ability to affect or influence the society as a writer essentially had been destroyed. But I think you raise a really important issue, because it's not fair. It's and those of us who are privileged enough to be able to leave are leaving behind people who are not privileged enough to leave. This is Rosen Malone. How much more do you think the wealthy Arab states will put up with Israel? They seem very unhappy with the attack on Qatar. They haven't done anything. What could they do? Well, they could do a lot, but they won't. It was the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan set up the land bridge to funnel hundreds of trucks a day into Israel, when Yemen, the only country that's attempted to intervene to stop the genocide, shut down maritime traffic. These regimes are very fragile, unpopular regimes. King Abdullah in Jordan, Sisi in Egypt, they're terrified of their own Islamist movements, the Muslim Brotherhood. They hate Hamas. They have traditionally always paid lip service to the struggle of the Palestinians. I think on the Arab street, I've spent quite a bit of time in the Middle East since October 11th, and certainly on the street, people are outraged. I mean, I was at demonstrations in Amman where people were chanting, "We are all Hamas." But among the ruling, and these are also client regimes that beholden to the United States. So I had dinner when I was in Egypt about a year ago with the former Minister of Information under Gamal Abdel Nasser, and of course Sadat threw him in prison for 10 years. And he said, Israel is allowed to do what it does not because it's strong, but because the Arab countries are weak. And I think that's right. I think if we had Arab nationalists like Nasser in the old non-aligned movement with Nehru and Tito, this genocide would not be happening. Lenny Brotman, the machine curates which stories are prominently featured and which are forgotten. Other than journalism, what are the best remedies for so many Americans taking their outrage cues from the media? It's interesting. There are still good books. I guess they allow them to be published because nobody reads them. And I try, in probably 70% of the people I interview are authors, and I read the books. I don't like being interviewed as an author when the person hasn't read my book, and I can instantly tell when they haven't. But there still are good books, but they don't get any publicity, and they have very small print runs, but they're out there. McCoy just did a new book on the Cold War. And I try always, I just interviewed Rashid Holiday, whose book, 100-Year War in Palestine, very good book. So they're there, and I would turn to those books while you still can. This is Scarilla. Thank you for all your work. Thank you. How much does rapture ideology play into the current policy? Also, how can we organize with the frightening grip on free speech? Yeah, the rapture, which isn't in the Bible, it's all magical thinking. It's all, and I would read my book, American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War in America. I spent 2 years with the Christian right, and came to the stories of despair. The first chapter is called Despair. And, these people have been cast aside by the wider society. They struggle with all of the pathologies of a diseased society: alcoholism, drug addiction, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, addictions like gambling, suicide. And the world conspired against them, and so they retreated into magical thinking, magic Jesus. And it's the only way they can cope. And the rage that they feel at the rest of the world is partly that, not only a rage at what had been done to them, and that they have every right to be angry, but also a rage at a world that attempts to take them away from the only thing psychologically holding them together, which is magic Jesus and the rapture. And the idea that Jesus watches out for them, and Jesus will ensure their prosperity, and that they may not have health insurance, but Jesus will cure them of their cancer or whatever. So it's you and I, at the end of that book, I came to the conclusion that you're not going to argue these people out of this irrational belief system. You've got to reintegrate them into the economy, to give them a sense of place, a sense of standing, a sense of worth, a future. And that short of that, this is the conclusion of this book, which I wrote a decade ago, we would be headed for a Christian fascist state. And that's exactly what's happening. David Anderson, do you think there was a point in our history where we split away from growing democracy onto a road to fascism? Yes. And that was when we essentially broke the back of the working class. That would be the early 1970s. Deregulated the society. And this was something that Ralph Nader warned against. It's something I've spent a lot of time writing about in my books. That when you create that level of social inequality and political stagnation, it's essentially a bankrupt liberalism. It always gives birth to fascism. Fascism is born out of a bankrupt liberalism. Anarchy for all. It seems like the U.S. and or Israel have propped up the most prominent jihadist groups, from Al-Qaeda when they were still the Mujahideen, to Al-Qaeda when they were waging war against Bashar al-Assad, and now today, when the leader of HTS is in New York at the UN. Why is the U.S. constantly propping up its alleged enemy, and now literally sponsoring one of its leaders? Because they think in the short term. So I was in Gaza when Hamas was created in the first Intifada. I knew one of the co-founders of Hamas, Dr. Abdelaziz Rantisi. The Israelis saw Hamas as a way to break the hegemony of Fatah or the PLO. So, to what extent they gave them money, I don't know. But when they carried out mass arrests, they tended to leave the Hamas members alone. Netanyahu later saw the split between the Palestine Authority and Hamas as beneficial to Israel, because it meant there was no unified front to the Palestinians. And as you know, we, of course, supported bin Laden and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And there's always, in the Chalmers Johnson writes about this, there's always blowback. There's blowback from these policies. But it's because they think short term. I mean, I used to cover the Kurds, and the Kurds, that went through periods where the United States was arming them, and then there was a famous deal between Kissinger and the Shah, and they just cut them off and betrayed them. So they think short term, and they don't. What's expedient at the moment to achieve the particular goals they have, and they don't consider the long term consequences. Sparky, is it true you use a Schofield Bible or one of its derivatives? I don't use a Schofield Bible. I mean, I tend to use, one of the more modern translations. But I mean, to be honest, I don't spend many evenings reading the Bible. I kind of read it enough. Magpie, are protests helping? I'm old, by now so tired, but still go, can't give up for my grandchildren. Yeah, the protests help. I mean, at the very least, they keep another narrative alive. They affirm our own dignity. They, create some kind of pressure on the centers of authority. So, yeah, I don't think we should stop. I think that's both, kind of spiritual and political death. Michael Boulos, do you foresee the U.S. balkanizing? Well, you did that. Harkin, do you think there are countries currently practicing economic systems that are viable ways forward for the U.S.? I feel that most of society's problems are really about unfair income distribution. Yeah, I think it's unfair income distribution. Certainly there, I lived in France, I lived in Switzerland. Everybody had access to really good healthcare, especially in Switzerland, which was actually private. It was private, but it was heavily regulated by the state. So we all paid 350 francs, and if you were poor, you didn't have to pay anything. That's one of the best healthcare systems in the world. So, yeah, there are residues of that socialist project that took root in Europe that are still there. They're degraded. I mean, this is what Macron did in France. Of course, Tony Blair dismantled the the socialist programs in the UK, and that what they do is with the NIH, the National Institute for Health, they defund it so it doesn't work, which is what Canada is doing, by the way. So it will hopefully, in the eyes of the oligarchs, push people to privatized healthcare system. But of the industrialized countries, we're certainly the cruelest, because if you don't have means, when you fall right to the bottom. Rosen Malone, how do you think the Palestinians manage to hold on to their faith, both Muslims and Christians? Their faith seems very deep. Well, it's interesting about war because, you see the worst and you see the best at the same time. So the war brings out the capacity we all have for evil, and the Palestinians, like any people, are no exception. And yet it also brings out these magnificent figures who carry out amazing acts of self-sacrifice. I would point to the doctors, the Palestinian doctors, the Palestinian journalists, and having just come back from Egypt. Joe Sacco and I have been in Egypt interviewing Palestinians from Gaza for the book we're doing. There were amazing stories of people who carried out acts of incredible kindness and self-sacrifice. And these people are, ironic points of light, to quote Auden, and they exist despite the savagery that the Palestinians endure. River Music's, given the role religion played in the early part of your life, do you consider yourself an atheist? No, I do not consider myself an atheist. I'm not a particularly orthodox believer. I am ordained. I don't cling to a particular doctrine, but I believe that the best of religion, like the best of art, deals with those forces in life. I wouldn't call them irrational, non-rational forces: beauty, truth, grief, the struggle for a life of meaning, the struggle to grapple with our own mortality. I mean, and art does this too. And I don't think that you have a complete life. The Buddhists say you can memorize as many sutras as you want; it won't make you wise. And I think that the best of, I love Camus. Camus considered himself an atheist. But I think the best in art, the best in religion, seeks to remind us of what it is to lead a complete life. In terms of, my looking at the world, I think my grounding in a religious tradition has helped me in that I have a very dark view of human nature. I have a dark view of power. Power almost always wins. That's the fundamental story of the crucifixion. And yet we're called to stand with the crucified of the earth, to quote James Cone. with a full understanding that when you stand with the oppressed, you will eventually get treated like the oppressed. And that is a kind of liberating experience, because you understand that you won't be rewarded for virtue. You're not rewarded for virtue, not by the kind of material aspects of the world, but that imparts a life of meaning. It imparts a life of purpose. It uh, it keeps alive empathy, compassion. I mean, all of those qualities that we are watching the hyper-masculine fascist state. I mean, watch the Kirk rally attempt to crush. So in the end, I think that grounding in kind of a religious tradition has been exceedingly helpful, because I don't I'm kind of divorced from the short-term highs and lows that characterize a consumer society. And I fully expect William Stringfellow used to call them the principalities, or the centers of power almost always win. And there you get into the power of good. Daniel Berrigan, who baptized my youngest daughter, used to say, I asked him how he defined faith. He said the belief that the good draws to it the good, even though we don't see it. I mean, the Buddhists call it karma, but I think that's right. So in terms of that orientation, understanding of the world, yes, I would define myself as religious. Curious Adams, if you were a transgender U.S. citizen in the U.S., would you leave the U.S. now or soon? I worry a lot about not just transgender, but the whole GBLTQ community. Remember, Charlie Kirk was a rabid homophobe, and he used to quote a passage in Leviticus about stoning homosexuals to death approvingly. And I think that he's a window into the belief systems of J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller and all the people around Trump. And if you're GBLTQ, or if you're transgender, probably in an urban setting, you may be able, but I worry about these people who live in rural settings, where they're, very vulnerable, very unprotected. But it's not good now, and it's not going to get better. Andrew Coyle, I love your report. Thank you. Do you practice as a Presbyterian minister? Do you struggle with this at present, given the evils of the world? So I was, it's a long story, but I was ordained in 2014. You can watch it on YouTube, by the way. Type in Chris Hedges ordination. We have a great blues band. James Cohen preaches the sermon, but the whole service was geared around mass incarceration. And that's what I was ordained to do. I do look at it as a ministry. There's also, if you type in Chris Hedges graduation, you'll probably either get Rockford, where I'm booed off the stage, but you'll also get a 20-minute talk I gave to my students when they got their BA degrees through Rutgers in the prison program. And I do, most of my students are Muslim, and I'm not trying to bring them to Jesus, but I do consider it a ministry. I do consider it a calling in that sense. Those are words I'm kind of loath to use in public and would be loath to use around them. But if you're asking me how I view it, that is how I view it. And this is Anna Amato. Have you ever had an interview or discussion with Noam Chomsky? If not, will you consider it anytime soon? I have. So there are several interviews I did with Noam, and I know Noam. If you just go into YouTube and type Chris Hedges, Noam Chomsky, they'll probably come up. Noam had a stroke and cannot speak at the moment. So I did one of the last interviews with him before I got thrown off of the Real News. But yeah, I've interviewed Noam several times. And of course, I'm a huge admirer of Noam Chomsky. So are we about, yeah, we'll take one more question. This is Andrew Acosta. Who are private security companies accountable to? Can the GHF, this is the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or their mercenaries be stopped or held accountable, better or worse than typical soldiers? Well, they're thugs, mercenaries, goons. I mean, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation recruits from Aryan biker gangs. It's run completely by the IDF. And watch the interview I did with Tony Aguilar. It's very good. He was a former Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel, was hired by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and just kind of lays out what that situation was like with great courage, and calls them out for their indiscriminate killing, etc. And the using of food as kind of bait to lure starving Palestinians into concentration camps that are being built in southern Gaza. Yeah, I mean, this whole rise of mercenary forces and vigilante groups, that's part of any fascist movement. They always rely heavily on vigilante groups because there's deniability. They can carry out, this was what the brown shirts were, for instance, in Nazi Germany. And so they would carry out excesses the way ICE does or anything else. And then that's deniable, although ICE is not a vigilante group, it's a federal militia. But vigilante groups are common to totalitarian systems, and their attraction in a totalitarian regime is that they're one step removed from the regime itself. You know, it's all about, I mean, Eric Prince, and it's about money. It's about these contractors, for instance, in Iraq and Afghanistan, were making insane amounts of money. I think the mercenaries who work for Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, it's in the interview I did with Tony, I think they're making $1,500 a day. Yeah, it's about money, and it's about deniability, that they can carry out excesses as the contractors did in terms of killings in Fallujah and everywhere else, and they're never held accountable, and that pleases the state very much. All right, well, I'm still here for now, and hopefully you are too. And we have to keep doing what we can. Thanks.